Well, I think a couple things that Laura said I just wanted to underline. One is GSVC is very much a student-led and student-run organization. It gets some help from the university, but it's a little bit like a weed that took root 15 years ago. You just can't kill it. It won't go away. It keeps growing organically around the world, and it's really because of the student commitment. And today, what's really exciting is you're going to get to hear from two students who were involved with the competition in various ways, both as organizers and participants, who have gone on to really flourish in their lives. And when we were thinking about who could really speak meaningfully to our gathering today, who could provide some really kind of practical guidance and authentic perspective, we couldn't think of two people more qualified than Priya, Haji, and Kirsten, Tobey. And I had the great fortune of interacting with them during their years here at Haas and at the GSVC. So what we thought we would do is just convene a little bit of conversation. It was my idea for Priya to bring Zen. Anyway, so 15 years ago, my daughter, Lily, was 4, and I would bring her to the GSVC things because that's what we just did on the weekends, and now she's in college, so I thought, we just do that. So Priya, come up, and Zen, if you want to come up, you can come up too, and Kirsten, come up. I don't know who else you're bringing yet. We don't have a name yet.
I don't know yet either.
I got to tell you one thing, just a warning, okay? Kirsten's business partner, Kristen Richmond, is another student and graduate of the GSVC program. And one of my favorite experiences in my life was when Kirsten and Kristen were just about to graduate from Haas, right? It was the last week of school. You were just finishing up all your courses, and most importantly, you had just finished the business plan and the term sheet for Revolution Foods. It was incredible. It was a whirlwind of things happening at the end of school. And Kirsten and Kristen came to my office, which at the time was in Mill Valley, and with my colleague Andy Donner, who's also a graduate of Haas and GSVC and Net Impact, and we were sitting and we were talking about the financing and getting the company launched, and it was incredible because it had just been an idea in a class a few months, or a semester before, and then all of a sudden in the office, Kristen said, she kind of tapped her belly, and she went into labor. Right there. Right in the middle of this business pitch, So I just wanted to warn you. I don't know. I don't take any responsibility for that, but I feel a little bit like the midwife. I am the midwife. I'm the midwife of Revolution Foods. That's right. And to that point, I was talking to Laura earlier. I've had a lot of failures in my career. But and I've spent the last 10 or 12 years in venture capital, which is a very interesting and challenging business. But the greatest return on investment by far is the involvement with the students that have been involved in this program. So with that, let's get started. So think about this. Think about when you were here at the GSVC and when you were at Haas. Think back to when you were a participant. Bring us back to that moment and just share with us a little bit of where you were, what you were thinking, what you were feeling, what your ambition was. Just try to set the stage so the people here who have traveled from many, many, many miles to get here have a sense of what you felt like back whenever it was. It was like 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, something like that.
Well, for us, it was when we were competing in GSVC. It was 2007, 7 years ago, and it was about 8 months after we had graduated from Haas. So Kristen's baby was then 8 months old. He was born on our graduation day. And we had just gotten started. We rented a kitchen facility here in Emeryville, right down the street, and we were serving about 500 meals a day out of our small kitchen. We had a team of 6 of us that were working from about 3 in the morning until I don't even know what time at night, getting the meals out the door to a few schools in Oakland. And what was on our mind at that point was, how are we ever going to get healthy meals to schools in San Francisco and San Jose? We wanted to expand throughout the Bay Area. We weren't sure if we could handle the Bay Bridge traffic, and we were just starting to think about where we were going to build a bigger facility to be able to cook the meals, to get healthy meals across the bridges and throughout the Bay Area. And GSVC helped us to, I think, kind of open up our aperture a little bit and think even bigger than just expanding through the Bay Area and expanding. We then a year later expanded to Los Angeles, and then soon to Washington D.C. and Denver, and really started thinking much more nationally, I think, about the impact that we could have.
Sorry.
Hey, Zen.
Sorry.
Come here a second. Your mom's going to talk now. Priya?
Yes.
What year were you involved in this?
04.
04.
Yeah.
What was going on? You were still a student, right, when you entered, or?
No. We had graduated, and I started a company called World of Good with also a classmate from Haas. And we were working with small-scale artisan producers in developing countries, and initially with about 11 countries, ultimately with like 50. And we had a spot in the incubator, which was a basement of the Bancroft Hotel across the street. And we had sold in a first group of about 50 accounts where we had convinced them to take these products. And we had created sort of a brand identity, and really what we had created was a sales architecture that was unique to scale this and bring it in a very easy way to these retailers. And so, Zen. This was, whose idea was that?
I don't know. It wasn't it was a great idea.
I think, yeah, it's the difference between 2 and 4.
Yeah.
Zen, Medea's going to take you outside, okay? Come. Here, go for it. Go. Mama will be back, okay? Sorry.
He'll be back.
Yeah, he'll be back. It's the... So anyway, so we were basically at that point, I was driving around in my convertible, going to stores, delivering all these fair trade products. We were working with small-scale producers, and Siddharth was in the incubator. We had taken over all the space. We had Warehouse 1, which was a closet, and Warehouse 2, and we were had all this stuff everywhere. And our goal at that time was to figure out, how do you really build a very large-scaled market for these producers so that you could help create a lot more sustainable livelihoods in the countries where the products were being made, and educate consumers in the U.S. in the process. And so we entered, our other co-founder was still a student, and David Gendelman. And we entered that year, and and it kind of all came together through the competition, actually, for us.
Let's talk about this a little bit, because both of you have co-founders. And this was really interesting, because I think at that stage of life, too, and then being in the university setting, and of course we're attracting teams here of co-founders, I'm always struck at how essential that is, the dynamic, the complementary characteristics. And each of you have had really long-term relationships with your co-founders, and you've played different roles, sometimes in front, sometimes in back. And I'm always struck at how historically in business the co-founder story gets rewritten. I like even ask people in their 20s, or who was Paul Allen, or who was Steve Wozniak, or people don't know necessarily that there was somebody behind Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, and so one of the things that I think both of you have exemplified is really the cultivation of partnership. And I mean, you still have classmates that are working at at Revolution Foods who aren't front and center, but are really solid members of the team. Why don't you talk a little bit about, share some of your insights about partners and what does it take to be a good partner? What have you learned? Did you expect, when you were just starting out, like as a young team, how things would turn out? Maybe even share a little bit about where things have been, challenging and what you've brought, to it.
Well, for us, it's so funny every time I come into this room, because this is the room where I met Kirsten. We were in math camp together. And I remember it was at the end of the first day of math camp, our other classmate who knew both of us in different ways before business school said, you guys have to meet each other, not just because your names are really similar, Kirsten and Kristen, but, because I think you guys have some shared interests in education and food and health. And so we started talking at that point and got to know each other over our first year. And then, it was early on in our second year that we really started kind of crafting this idea of Revolution Foods. And I think it was, the partnership really, Revolution Foods started as an idea that we both really shared. And so it just became, it was kind of like, we both had a big part in, crafting different parts of the idea. And I think that we've been a very complementary pair ever since. And, a lot of it, I think, is that we have very complementary skills to each other and we both really respect the skills that the other one has. And there's a little bit of yin and yang in it where we, neither of us has ever really wanted to play the role that the other one is, but we've always been able to step into each other's shoes when we've needed to. And so I think there's just such a strong kind of mutual respect between the two of us that, our partnership has become a part of the identity of the company in many ways. And, and not just because we're both moms and we're both, we have similar names. And so it used to be when somebody would call the office and we had one phone, they would say, oh, can I talk to Kirsten? And, either of us would just say, yep, this is she, what can I do? How can I help you? And, but increasingly we've built more, more definition around each of our roles and what we each contribute. But I just think there's such a strong mutual respect there that neither of us feel like we could, be doing what we're doing without the other one, from both the building the business perspective, but also from a personal perspective. We've supported each other through, each of us having 2 kids over the last 7 years and have been able to, juggle our responsibilities with our families and with work and that sort of thing. But we've also just, continued to build the team together, and it's been just an amazing relationship and an amazing experience to do this together. And I think I couldn't imagine doing it without a partner and a sounding board and somebody to call when there's a big question or what are we going to do about this. We share everything kind of that's going on with the business, and I think we both have helped each other work through some really tough decisions and tough kind of business decisions, where to expand to, whether to enter the world of consumer packaged goods or not, and how to maintain the impact and the mission of what we're doing at the same time as growing a successful business. And I think that's been we've both played different roles at different times in those discussions, but it's been just an incredible journey together.
Well, I'm actually a 4-time entrepreneur. So after World of Good, I actually now started another company that I'm the CEO of. And in each of mine, I've always had co-founders. And for World of Good and GSVC, Siddharth was my classmate, and David was then a year below us in school. But the thing I would say about co-founders, and I think the most important thing you can do today is meet everyone around you, because you really don't know who they are always, and you don't know how it's going to come together. But the process, I think, of trying to build a company on your own could be really hard and really lonely and could be really frustrating. It's a process that does have moments where you feel like you're on top of the world, you're going to just kill it, everything's going great, and then like literally 24 hours later, you could be like laying on the floor going, oh my gosh, like this is never going to work. And like you actually feel that level of ups and downs in the early stages and sometimes even in the middle stages of the company, depending on what kinds of things are going on throughout. And having another person who part of that process, who cares about it with you, who thinks about it with you, is really powerful. I think the most important characteristic of the relationship with your founders, and I think that was reflected in what we were just talking about with Revolution Foods, but I think the most important thing is a kind of openness and transparency and a true friendship. And I think people always say like, oh, don't start companies with your friends. Don't, I don't believe that. I mean, I actually think that whether you start as friends or you become friends, the process is so intense, it's either going to happen, or if it doesn't, it's probably a co-founding relationship that didn't work. And so I think it's really important to find the person who you really can talk to and work with, and to the point, has complementary skills, has all of those things. But when Sammy, who's my co-founder on Save Up, and I started, he's younger than me by like 10 years, and he went to Stanford too. And the company we're running now, the number one test for me of whether or not we could be co-founders wasn't, is he a great coder? Can he do this? Can he do that? The great test was when we talked about the harder things that might happen in a business, could we talk about it? And when we talked about what mattered to our lives and what mattered for the financial outcomes of the company, we were aligned. When we talked about the principles and the values and what we wanted in the company, we could talk about it and we were aligned. And I think those are the real things that define a good co-founding relationship. And the skills are important, but beyond the skills, it's all those alignments and ability to communicate through them that really matter, I think.
One of the things that I think is interesting for both of your founding experiences too was the fact that you were able to enroll a really interesting and talented group of people, just like the GSVC founders do every year, of bringing in and all of the teams that you saw coming from around the world. And I think of your fellow students that were part of that, that maybe didn't emerge as being birthed, with the team, but played some role and have gone on, in their own careers in really exciting ways. So I just think it's really important. You'd never know that. Like I think of Jonathan Klein, I think, and he's now, doing all kinds of incredible things in education, and think about, David and what Siddharth's doing now. So I wanted to just kind of note that at this juncture, when you're involved in this kind of formation period, that there's just so many talented people, and they may go in, different directions.
Not only that, I think years later, you pick up the phone, you call them for totally different reasons. Like, I mean, I remember we were starting to distribute to college bookstores, and we called and, looked in the Haas alumni directory, and, oh, there's a Haas alum, who was around, oh, wow, okay, let's just call that person. And, that does make a huge difference, and you don't know when you're going to call them or how many years later into your adventure that your networks are going to be important. So give a little perspective on, what you think a social venture is, or how has it changed, in the last 7, 8 years, 10 years? It's interesting because I think when we were exploring this in class and at the competition, it seemed like it was something that was supposedly like a little different, or it had a different operating system. But now the things that you guys are doing are really grown into mainstream positions. You have mainstream investors. You have mainstream employees from different companies that have had different experiences. So maybe share a little bit about your perspective on the trajectory of the last decade or so of social venturing, or what does it mean? What does this mean to integrate a social value or an environmental value into that business model of what it is you're trying to accomplish? You go first.
Well, so I think when we first started, we thought really hard about becoming a nonprofit, and because we had such a strong sort of social mission, behind what we wanted to do, and it still felt at that time like that if you had a strong social mission, you should become a nonprofit, and we almost had to apologize to some people when we decided to incorporate as a for-profit. And that was partly with the influence of people like you saying, no, you can start a viable business with a social mission, but it wasn't a mainstream. It didn't feel like a mainstream idea at that point. And we talked a lot about the mission and a lot about and I think a couple of years in, we started realizing, I think also with your help and emphasis on the concept of a brand, that actually in social venture, your brand is your mission. And you can't kind of separate the two. You can't have sort of, we've got this underlying social mission, but then we've got this brand that means something else. It's like the two are so intricately connected. And I don't think we fully recognized that in the early days, when we were first writing the business plan. I think we sort of thought of ourselves as this, this organization with a great social mission, and we happened to decide to incorporate as a for-profit company because we needed access to capital, because we're a capital-intensive company. We needed to build out kitchen facilities and hire a production team and buy a truck and all these things, and there just wasn't funding for that in the nonprofit world. We couldn't find a single foundation who was willing to write a $500,000 check so we could build out a commercial cooking facility, but we could find angel investors and sort of social impact-driven investors who were willing to take a risk on us at that point. And so I think, it was just, even just the capital availability was just starting to kind of become more prevalent, that there were investors who were willing to invest in sort of a social mission driven company. And I think today it feels like there's much more of a broad acceptance of mission driven businesses, because there's a recognition that mission driven businesses often have very valuable brands, and that brand can represent something that is connected to a social mission and a social impact, and that in fact, from a consumer perspective, consumers prefer mission-driven brands. They want to wear clothes that mean something deeper than just it's a good-looking jacket. It actually has a connection to a cause and that sort of thing. So I think there's been both a consumer shift in the tide, but also a major shift in the capital markets, and the willingness of investors, even more traditional investors, to invest in mission-driven brands because that brand has real market value.
And it's really cool to do now.
And it's cool. Yeah. It's become cool.
Well, I think for me, it's interesting because before I came to Haas, I had founded a nonprofit with the for-profit under it, which was in the healthcare, substance abuse, HIV and AIDS in prevention world. And that was a large nonprofit with public funding, and then we did a for-profit that did employment and affordable development, and that brought funds into the nonprofit. But when I came to Haas, a big part of why I was here was because I really felt like to scale things that created social impact, they needed market-driven scalability. And so that was a big part of why I came to Haas to even go to school. And then when I was at Haas and started learning a lot more about fair trade and sustainable supply chains, and actually one of the founders of the fair trade organization in the United States, Paul Rice, is an alum of Haas. He was maybe 5 or 6 years before me. So I think that influenced my thinking. And what I saw at that time that was very much changing was the idea that you could develop commercial enterprises that had mission and purpose. And I definitely agree around the idea that the brand values and promise were part of how the contract around the product and the values are really made. So in World of Good, there was really the premise and the promise of fair trade in every product, on the tags, in the story, in the way it was presented in retail. All of those things solidified the core values of what we were working on. And at the same time, we did it as a side-by-side at that time. So we had a for-profit with a nonprofit side-by-side and a hybrid. And the reason we did that was we wanted to build all these technologies around measuring fair wages and looking at supply chain monitoring. And we wanted that to be housed in the public interest with public funds and not really encumber the for-profit. And that was what we put in the nonprofit. And then in the for-profit, we actually raised totally separate capital. We did retail and branding and all of that, and that was ultimately the business side that commercialized the products. And for us at that time, it really felt like putting these in separate things was the right thing. And ultimately it was, in the sense that the business became part of eBay ultimately, and the wholesale division was acquired by a company in Seattle that does wholesale distribution. And then ultimately the nonprofit merged actually to Paul Rice's organization at Fairtrade USA, and has continued to build these technologies around measuring fair wages. And so that architecture served each piece of what we were doing correctly. And then I would say what's continued to evolve that I love is the new one that I'm running now, Save Up, is about empowering people to save money and pay down debt through building a game. And this one has completely traditional venture funding. There was some of that in World of Good, but this one is like Blue Run True Ventures and is totally a technology company. And so I do agree that the market keeps changing in terms of how these kinds of businesses can get built, and what kinds of capital are willing to engage and on what terms. So it's a really interesting and evolving space. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to still drive innovation in what you're doing, and to think creatively and push the envelope. Like, don't be afraid. Like when we did the sort of hybrid, I mean, a lot of people were like, are you sure? Is that right? Is that legal? And we were one of the first ones to do that. And now it's actually a really common structure. It's not at all unique at all, I don't think. And I think that you have to find the right approach for what you're working on. And there isn't a prescriptive way for that to be defined, and that's part of actually what you get to be an entrepreneur about. It's not just your business, but it's also about your sector, and that's kind of cool.
So there's an old saying about the only constant is change, but I think for both of you, the only constant is you're always raising money. No, any entrepreneur. I don't mean to point, pick on you guys, but
building revenue.
I happen to know that
sales are raising money.
Yeah, right. So just, we're going to run out of time, and this is so fascinating. We could sit here all day, but think of just something you would offer to the entrepreneurs of the future here about fundraising, and from your perspective, is there anything special in a social venture or a pointer that you want to share about how to raise money successfully year after year after? I'm teasing you. I, in full disclosure, I've been an investor in both of your endeavors. So,
well, I think one of the most important things is to recognize that businesses need capital, but that capital comes with a face, right? And it's been really important to us as we've brought money into the company for the various stages of growth that money comes with whether it's a person on your board, an investor that you're interacting with, and we've been so fortunate to build a group of investors who have been so supportive of our growth and our mission and our brand, and I can't imagine. I could imagine that it could go a different way, that you might bring on an investor who wants to take the company a different direction, or who doesn't believe fully in the mission of what you're trying to accomplish. And I think just as you're considering taking capital from different sources, consider the face that comes with, and the person and the institution that comes with, because we've had such I think good fortune with the people that we've brought around the table in being aligned around where we're going with this, the impact that we want to have from a social mission perspective and from a business growth perspective.
And the time horizon.
Exactly,
really important.
The time horizon is really important, that we've found
term
investors who've been supportive of building a great company and knowing that great things will come to a great company, and rather than saying, well, we've got to get our money out in 3 years or 5 years or whatever it might be. We've had really I think patient capital that's come with, and it pays off, because we've reached heights, I think, in 7 years that we couldn't have possibly reached in 3 years or 5 years, and so we're now in our 8th year, and I think it's we've had just, I think, great patience and great support around the table from our investors.
Yeah, I think the things that we were saying about co-founders, I feel the same way about your investors. I mean, they're basically they are your other co-founders. However, I know a lot of entrepreneurs get in this weird framework of like, oh, I'm selling part of my equity, and this is like somehow taking away from me. I mean, the other way to think about it is that really you're putting gas in the tank to give you a chance to build your revenues or build your scale or build your infrastructure or whatever. And those individuals are your other co-founders in the company. And I think the most important thing, I think, is to build those relationships also with a lot of transparency and clarity. I know that, and your investors are going to be there for the good and the bad. And they're going to be the ones that you have to look across the table with and think through the most challenging circumstances. And your integrity and their integrity in that moment is going to really matter. So I would say that the other thing that's really important, and I don't know if this is, anyway, I'll just weave this in now, but it's interesting because on this last company, when I started Save Up, and we were raising capital for this, I knew I wanted to have kids. And it was kind of an unusual thing. I mean, we raised pretty much Sand Hill Road venture capital up and down going up and down and meeting with like all these different funds. And my co-founder, Sammy, like I said, is a lot younger than me. He's a CTO. He's a guy. That's another thing. He fits more of the traditional Silicon Valley investment profile. And I had told Sammy, I want to have kids. And the other part of my story is I'm actually not married. And I was just like, I don't want to miss out on having kids. So this is just something I want to do. And Sammy and I were very transparent about that as co-founders. And he was like, okay, cool. If that's really what you want to do, I support you. And he actually commutes from Palo Alto so that I could live and work near my house in San Francisco. So that was his gift to me. And his wife is at Stanford. So he did that. And then when we went in the fundraise, I told Sammy, I'm like, I really want to tell these investors before I raise the capital, because I don't want anyone to invest who's then going to be like freaking out about that later, or even worse, think I got pregnant by accident. I mean, just anything weird. I was like, I don't want that to happen.
It's not an accident.
Yeah, no, mine is totally not an accident. It's like so intentional. And so, so in the process of the meetings, Sammy was like, I trust you if you think that's the right thing to do. I was kind of responsible for leading the raise as the CEO. When we were, of course, first we had, the core of the value prop, what we were doing, our business plan, all that. But the rule we set was that if we got back for a second meeting, there's a pretty good chance at that point you're going to get further along. You're probably going to get a term sheet if you're back in the Valley. So I was like, okay, second meetings, we have to tell them. We had 6 second meetings, all guys, of course, sitting across the table, not one woman. And in every second meeting, we told them. I told them. And the really interesting thing was we got 6 term sheets, so there wasn't an effect on the term sheet process. And if anything, I think later it led to us being in the position, one, we chose the right investors, certainly, but we built real partnerships. And I think what investors are ultimately looking for, of course, is your acumen, your hunger for the business you're building, your thoughtfulness and planning. But the other thing, ultimately, is they're hoping that you're going to steward the best possible outcome to their capital. And they're trusting you, and you may or may not always be able to do a great job. I mean, or you may not be able to defy whatever may be going on around you. But really, more than anything, what they need from you is honesty. And I think that is what ultimately that process reflected, and I think it wasn't the wrong thing. It turned out to be the right thing to do. And I hope that when you raise capital, you approach it in a vein, I think the kind of stories that I think end badly often are entrepreneurs where there's sort of 2 stories they're running. The one they have inside, and then the one that they're running for a potential investor or their ultimate investor. Because ultimately, that person is so intimate to what you're doing that there is no such thing as 2 stories. So just be clear, just like they were about their mission, about their passion, just like we were, just like about whatever is going on and what you think is going to impact the company. You need people to enter knowing the risks and signing up to be there with you through that. And hopefully it goes great. And if it doesn't, you have your integrity, and they do too, and that's important.
I think that's so wise, and just in credit to both of you, I think you've both been great teachers to me, to your fellow students, to the people you've worked with about that issue, about being direct. I read an article just the other day, I can't remember which business publication, but it was basically that CEOs really struggle with conflict, that where they fall down is that they can't have the difficult conversation. And I think what I'm hearing from both of you too is just setting the tone that if you set the tone of openness and transparency, honesty, integrity, then then the conversations don't have to be difficult conversations. Every conversation is just a conversation.
Maybe that's because we need more women CEOs.
Well, I was just going to get to that. Okay, you're right in front of me as usual. But so I, so watching the Revolution Foods board up until about 2 years ago, the entire management company was women. And I've sat on a lot of boards, and I have to say it is and was the most functional management team. Kelly McElhaney, I hope you're listening. The most functional management team. And we're going to run out of time, but just talk about this a little bit, because I remember, in class, people with, idealistic values, want to change the world, do it through business, want to be an entrepreneur, and then this conversation would come up, and I want to have a balanced life. And I would always say, you remember, I'd say, forget about it. There's no balance in entrepreneurship. It's all in. You can't have a balanced life. But both of you have really achieved, astounding things. I think you're inspirational in terms of your roles as parents and leaders, and you're here giving back today. I mean, hopefully you'll be here the rest of the day. It'll be great. But talk a little, what's the magic? How do you do it? How do you make everybody happy all the time?
Well, I mean, I think you're right that there is no balance, but you just have to be okay with it. And there are times when when one thing has to give, and times when another thing has to give. And I think one thing that Kirsten and I have both sort of agreed on is that our families do come first, even though, and that doesn't mean that we work any less. But it means, like this morning I went and watched my daughter do her dance performance in her elementary school in her assembly before I came here, and we both have found ways to carve out the time that we want and we need to support our families, and we both have found ways with our husbands to have a lot of give and take in the relationship, and sometimes that take lasts for a couple of years, and then you have another year when you can give back. And it's I think one of the most important things that somebody's most important piece of advice that anybody's given me is and this was more of like a sort of a marriage piece of advice, but I think it applies to business and business relationships too, is if you start keeping score, that's when it's falling apart. And that you just have to give and take and not keep score. And I think there's been a really valuable lesson for us in that. And if you feel like and somebody else said, if you start counting the hours of sleep that you're getting, that's also a sign that things are going downhill. Because that just stresses you out. If you start being like, oh my God, I didn't sleep enough last night, I'm not going to sleep enough tonight. And I think those are the kinds of things that just you have to give and take and roll with the punches a little bit. But also, when you do have little ones in the family, you've got to focus on them when they need the time and the attention. And I've been really fortunate to have a husband who's willing to work from home and take a lot of the burden of the calls from school that the kid is sick and needs to be picked up and that sort of thing when I haven't been able to do it. And I think as a mom, that's sometimes hard to deal with that guilt, but then at the same time, I'm giving back in a lot of other ways. And so there's and I also feel like I'm a much better mom being a successful entrepreneur than I would be if I was staying at home full time, going crazy, pulling my hair out with my kids all the time. So, I think there's just the balance comes in many different ways, and it's not just about spending a certain number of hours doing each thing each day. It's about having the mental flexibility to have give and take in every part of your life.
Priya, your ventures and your life have really, I think, involved community. I mean, everything you've done, there's been a community that you've sort of convened and cultivated and brought along with you. And I was, awestruck at the community that you created around your becoming a mother.
That's true.
And
it's true. I don't have a husband who can help me, but it is true that I called it instead of romantic, it was friend-mantic. So there's now like 60 people in this thing, so it's like...
Yeah, when you get an email from the friend-mantic group from Priya, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's like a lot of people who've been really, really supportive. Everything from like before I got pregnant, they used to come over and we'd have like wine and Rose's dinner. But it was like before I tried, so it was really sweet. It was like things like that. But now I would say those people are the ones that have helped me a lot. And the other part I would say as a mom is, and I don't know why it's not talked about more openly, but I also had to invest a lot of my financial resources in having help, because that's just practically the only way I felt like this could work. And having help to help raise your children, I don't think has to be a bad thing. I mean, my kids love me, they're very well attached to me, and yet I'm very lucky Medea who's here, or I have other people that have helped me as well. And I think that's a really important part. And it's interesting because in Indian culture, it's actually not weird to have help. It's very common, and I think in a lot of other developing countries as well, for a lot of educated women, it's considered very okay to have help. But somehow in the US, it's this idea that like the only way you can be a good mom is if you're the one that changed every diaper and you were there every single time something went wrong. And I don't actually think that's true, but that's a personal thing that everybody has to navigate. But I think that's the only way that it would be possible for me to take on the kind of responsibility I am and still do what I feel is my best to help these two little people find their potential in the world. So yeah, I think that's important. And then I think it is also the openness and communication with your team is really important. And I think the days of like pretending when you come to work like you're not a person, I just think those days are over, thank God. And I think women have brought those days to an end, and I think it's starting in small entrepreneurial companies, yes, but I even think in big companies now, those days are over. And if you're building whatever kind of company, you got to build it based on the reality of human existence, because ultimately whatever you build is just the composition of people, and our combined effort to do something together.
And I think this is the leadership wisdom that's also coming out of the legacy of this global social venture competition, this experiment in how businesses can not only perform a good deed and a mission in society, but how the organizations and the leaders can actually articulate and model and demonstrate a way of bringing your whole self to work so that what you do and who you are the same thing. And I'm just in awe of the progress that both of you have made, and for being here today. And this is just a great way to set the day off in motion. And thank you very much for being here.